Comfort is seductive, not because it makes life easier, but because it makes thinking unnecessary. We were not designed for a world where everything arrives instantly, effortlessly, and without friction. Convenience promised to free our minds, but instead, it quietly made them weaker. When every question has an automatic answer, every desire has a shortcut, and every discomfort has a digital escape, our ability to think deeply begins to fade. Tonight, we explore how comfort reshapes the modern mind, why convenience feels good but costs us clarity, and how a life without challenges leads to a mind without depth. We live in a world that would look miraculous to our ancestors, a world where food appears with a tap, where answers arrive in seconds, where machines handle tasks that once required days of labor, where entire libraries fit into a pocket, and where almost nothing requires the kind of physical or mental struggle that defined human life for thousands of years. Convenience has become the quiet architecture of modern existence, so woven into our routines that we rarely question it. We simply expect things to be easy. We expect processes to be smooth. We expect obstacles to disappear before we even encounter them. And because convenience has become so normal, we forget how radical it actually is. For most of human history, life was defined by effort, walking long distances, cooking from scratch, remembering information rather than retrieving it, solving problems alone rather than outsourcing them to devices, thinking through challenges instead of Googling solutions. Effort wasn't optional, it was reality. Today, that world feels distant. Tasks that once demanded attention, patience, discipline, and memory have been replaced with shortcuts. We no longer memorize directions, we follow GPS, arrows. We no longer read deeply, we skim summaries. We no longer preserve patience, we refresh notifications for instant stimulation. We no longer tolerate not knowing, we search immediately. The transformation is so complete that we often mistake convenience for progress, and in many ways, it is progress. Comfort has freed us from drudgery, from monotony, from many forms of pain. But every transformation carries a shadow. As comfort becomes the dominant force in daily life, something inside us begins to weaken slowly, quietly, invisibly. Not the body, but the mind. A world built to minimize effort inevitably minimizes the skills that effort once developed: patience, resilience, curiosity, discipline, critical thought, long attention, deep understanding. These qualities do not grow in comfort, they grow in friction, but friction has become scarce. Everything is optimized to remove it. Reminders instead of memory, tutorials instead of struggle, automation instead of problem solving, entertainment instead of boredom, convenience instead of challenge. And without challenge, the mind loses some of its sharpness, gradually, like a blade that has not been used. The consequences of this shift are not always dramatic or immediate. They reveal themselves in subtle ways. The discomfort we feel when forced to wait, the irritation that rises when something requires effort, the shrinking tolerance for complexity, the preference for simple answers, even when reality is not simple at all. Convenience has changed to not only how we live, but how we think. And yet, we rarely question it. We rarely ask what it means that everything is becoming easier. We rarely consider what we're losing in the process. Because comfort is pleasant. It seduces quietly, offering relief instead of reflection. And the more we lean into it, the more it shapes the very structure of our minds. It trains us to expect effortlessness, to seek shortcuts, to avoid discomfort, to prefer ease over inquiry. And once that expectation settles into the mind, something deeper happens. The brain begins to resist any task that doesn't match the effortless world we've constructed around ourselves. This is why long reading feels harder, why deep thinking feels heavier, why patience feels unnatural, why complexity feels annoying, why silence feels threatening. We are not losing intelligence, we are losing the habits that intelligence depends on. Convenience has become a psychological environment, one that quietly rewires the brain towards speed, simplicity, and passivity. The mind begins to prefer what is smooth and reject what is demanding, even when the demanding path leads to greater clarity and truth. And once we understand this, a deeper question emerges. Why does the brain cling to comfort so strongly? What is happening beneath the surface that makes effort feel so exhausting? and ease feels so addictive. To answer that, we must look not at technology or society, but at something older and more universal. The architecture of the human brain itself, and this is where our exploration naturally leads next. Because before we can understand how convenience kills critical thinking, we must understand why the mind instinctively avoids effort in the first place. If we want to understand why convenience shapes the modern mind so deeply, we need to start with something far older than technology: the ancient architecture of the human brain. Our minds were never designed for a world of constant ease. They were designed for survival, for managing scarce resources, unpredictable danger, and physically demanding environments. And in such a world, conserving energy was essential. Every moment of mental effort consumed precious calories. Every complex decision carried a biochemical cost. This is why the brain instinctively gravitates toward the path of least resistance. Not because we are lazy, but because, biologically, ease once meant safety. We are descended from people who minimized unnecessary effort. The instinct remains, even though the world has changed. Modern convenience exploits this instinct perfectly. It gives the brain exactly what it wants: simplicity, speed, predictability, the elimination of friction. With every automated task, every instant answer, every tap that replaces a thought, the mind is rewarded for choosing ease over effort. And slowly, without noticing, we begin to associate mental struggle with discomfort rather than growth. The brain's resistance to effort also expresses itself in its discomfort with conflict. Critical thinking often requires holding two opposing ideas in our awareness long enough to examine them honestly. But that tension is metabolically expensive. It creates cognitive friction, the very thing an energy-conserving brain tries to avoid. So instead of wrestling with complexity, the mind drifts toward ideas that feel smooth, harmonious, familiar. Comfort becomes more appealing than accuracy. The same instinct appears in the brain's reaction to uncertainty. Ambiguity requires patience. It requires us to sit in the space between not knowing and finally understanding. But uncertainty feels unstable, and the brain prefers stability, even if the stability is false. So it rushes to conclusions, grasps at quick explanations, accepts the first answer that delivers emotional relief. Convenience makes this even easier. Why tolerate the discomfort of not knowing when the answer is a tap away? Why explore something deeply when the surface seems good enough? Over time, we forget how to sit with a question. We forget how to follow a line of reasoning. We forget how to stay with a thought long enough for it to unfold into insight. The instinct for ease also appears in the brain's preference for immediate reward. Deep thinking is slow and rarely provides quick emotional payoff. Convenience, on the other hand, is built to deliver micro rewards instantly. A notification, a clear instruction, a simple solution. The mind begins to crave these fast hits, and anything that lacks instant reward starts to feel tiresome or too much work. This does not mean we are incapable of thinking deeply. It means the environment trains our deepest instincts against it. Effort becomes unfamiliar. Patience becomes uncomfortable. Curiosity feels optional, and complexity feels like an intrusion. Modern life has made effort feel unnatural, but effort is how thought grows. Effort is how the mind sharpens itself. Effort is how intelligence becomes something more than the passive absorption of information. And this brings us to a subtle turning point, a psychological shift that reshapes how we respond to the world around us. Because when comfort becomes the default, a new trait begins to emerge in its shadow. Impatience. Not just impatience with waiting, but impatience with thinking itself, with complexity, with uncertainty, with anything that cannot be resolved instantly. This impatience is not a harmless side effect. It is the force that begins to erode critical thinking at its root. And to understand how deeply it affects us, we must look at the next layer of the modern mind, the one shaped by immediacy, speed, and the promise of instant satisfaction. A world where everything appears at once cannot produce a mind that knows how to take its time. Modern life is built on immediacy. We order food without waiting, stream movies without pausing, search answers without thinking, receive messages without delay. Information, entertainment, validation, stimulation, all arrive the moment we desire them, often before we fully register the desire itself. This constant immediacy creates a psychological environment the human mind was never meant to inhabit. The brain adapts to whatever it experiences repeatedly, and when it is surrounded by instant reward, it begins to expect instant reward, not occasionally. Everywhere. Patience, once an ordinary part of life, now feels like an inconvenience. Waiting in line, reading a long paragraph, sitting with a difficult idea, enduring silence, tolerating confusion. These moments challenge a mind conditioned by speed. They feel strangely uncomfortable, almost unnatural, as if something is wrong simply because something is not immediate. But nothing is wrong. This discomfort is the accumulated effect of 1,000 conveniences reshaping our expectations. Instant gratification does more than reward impatience. It rewires our emotional reactions. When everything comes quickly, anything that doesn't arrives with a sense of friction. The mind begins to treat effort as a flaw, difficulty as failure, and slowness as an obstacle rather than a pathway. Even curiosity shrinks under this pressure. Why explore deeply when a shallow impression feels good enough? Why wrestle with a question when search engines instantly provide an answer? Why read 10 pages when a summary gives the illusion of understanding? The illusion is seductive. A drip of information feels like knowledge. A headline feels like clarity. A recommendation feels like taste. A shortcut feels like mastery, and slowly, the longing for depth fades. Not because we reject depth, but because we forget how to reach it. The mind grows accustomed to a world where struggle is unnecessary, and thus undesirable. This shift affects every aspect of thinking. When the brain expects instant reward, it loses tolerance for delayed understanding. Complex ideas feel heavy. Nuanced arguments feel exhausting. Long-term thinking feels irrelevant. This is why modern people often describe themselves as mentally tired even when they have done little intellectual work. It is not effort that exhausts them. It is the anticipation of effort. The expectation that things should already make sense without the slow process of comprehension. Instant gratification also reshapes our relationship with confusion. In the past, confusion was a natural stage in learning. Today, confusion feels like a glitch in the system, something to be avoided or outsourced. But confusion is not the enemy. Confusion is a sign that the mind is reaching beyond its current boundaries, stretching toward something new. It is the space between ignorance and insight. Yet the modern mind, raised on immediacy, treats confusion as a threat to comfort, and so it retreats into the familiar. The familiar opinions, the familiar shortcuts, the familiar forms of entertainment, the familiar answers that promise certainty without requiring reflection. Instant gratification trains the mind to seek resolution, not understanding. Resolution is quick. Understanding is slow. One is built for convenience. The other is built for growth. But the deepest impact of instant gratification lies not in speed itself, but in the emotional habits that speed creates. When everything arrives instantly, the self quietly absorbs a belief it never consciously chose. If it isn't easy, it isn't worth it. If it doesn't feel good immediately, it's wrong for me. If the answer isn't instant, the question doesn't matter. These beliefs form a hidden philosophy of comfort, a worldview where struggle has no purpose, patience has no value, and depth has no place. Yet, paradoxically, the things that matter most in human life, insight, discipline, creativity, wisdom, emotional resilience, all require slowness. They require presence. They require waiting. They require the willingness to stay with an experience longer than the mind wants to. And that is exactly what instant gratification erodes. But there is another layer to this transformation, one even more subtle. The quiet outsourcing of thinking itself. Because when the mind becomes conditioned to prefer instant answers, it becomes vulnerable to anything that offers them. It becomes easy to accept pre-made ideas, easy to trust recommendations, easy to stop questioning, and this leads us directly into the next stage of the comfort trap, a stage where technology doesn't just satisfy our desires, but begins to think on our behalf. There is a quiet shift happening in the background of everyday life, a shift so subtle that most people never notice it, yet so profound that it is reshaping the very structure of human thought. It is the moment when tools stop assisting our thinking and begin replacing it. Technology once acted as an extension of the mind, a way to enhance memory, expand our reach, accelerate communication. But convenience has pushed this relationship further. Today, Many tools don't just support our thinking. They make decisions for us, form judgments for us, filter information for us, and tell us what we should want, read, watch, believe, or choose. And the more decisions these tools make, the fewer decisions we make. This transfer of cognitive responsibility feels harmless, even helpful. GPS chooses the route, autocorrect chooses the words, recommendations choose the entertainment, apps choose the habits, algorithms choose the news, search engines choose the hierarchy of truth. The burden of choice dissolves, replaced by a smooth, frictionless path. But every decision we outsource is a decision we no longer practice making. Thinking is like a muscle. It strengthens when used, weakens when ignored. And today, many of our daily mental muscles are quietly atrophying when a machine answers before we even ask. The mind loses the instinct to question. When a platform predicts what we want, desire becomes shaped by external forces rather than internal reflection. When an algorithm filters the world for us, we stop filtering it ourselves. We begin to confuse what is recommended with what is meaningful, what is popular with what is true, what is easy with what is right. And as the tools become smarter, more precise, more anticipatory, the mind becomes less practiced, less patient, less willing to engage in the slow work of reasoning. This shift is not dramatic. It does not arrive with alarms or warnings. Instead, it enters silently through comfort. A shortcut here, a suggestion there, a pre-selected option, a curated stream, a tool that knows you better than you know yourself. Over time, the tools do not just simplify the world, they simplify us, and something important changes within the inner landscape. The feeling of effort becomes foreign. Why struggle to recall information when the phone remembers? Why wrestle with a problem when a search engine resolves it in seconds? Why reflect deeply when a recommendation promises exactly what you'll enjoy? Ease begins to feel natural. Effort begins to feel like a malfunction, and eventually, a dangerous inversion occurs. Instead of tools serving the mind starts adapting to the habits of the tools. It thinks in shorter bursts. It expects instant clarity. It avoids ambiguity. It seeks stimulation over reflection. It drifts into passivity. It becomes shaped by the pathways of technology rather than the pathways of inquiry. The tragedy is not that tools think for us, but that we stop noticing when they do. Because the more familiar automated thinking becomes, the more alien, independent thinking feels. And yet the real danger of outsourced thought is not simply cognitive weakening. It is the quiet erosion of autonomy. When our choices, preferences, beliefs, and desires are influenced by systems we don't see and don't question, our sense of self becomes porous. We may still feel like individuals, but the architecture of our inner world becomes increasingly external. The comfort of being guided becomes more appealing than the discomfort of navigating alone. This is not a technological problem. It is a psychological surrender. A surrender so quiet that it rarely feels like a choice. But every time the mind allows a tool to think on its behalf, it loses a small piece of its independence, and those pieces accumulate. To understand how this erosion continues, we must examine something deeper than technology itself. The mechanisms inside the mind that make easy decisions so irresistible. Because the next stage of the comfort trap is not about machines thinking for us. It is about why we willingly let them. That brings us gently to the next chapter, where we explore the subtle hunger for simplicity that shapes every thought we form. As tools begin thinking for us, another quiet force takes hold. One rooted not in technology, but in the limits of the human mind itself. A force that shapes our behavior far more than we realize. The exhaustion that comes from choosing. Every decision, no matter how small, consumes mental energy. And in a world overflowing with options, what to read, what to watch, what to buy, which app to open, which message to answer, which belief to agree with, the mind is constantly spending itself. Even simple choices accumulate a weight. By the middle of the day, many people feel a kind of invisible heaviness, a subtle depletion, as though their thoughts no longer move with the same clarity. This is not physical fatigue. It is cognitive fatigue. The mind grows tired not because it has worked deeply, but because it has been asked to make too many decisions without rest. When the brain becomes overloaded in this way, something predictable begins to happen. It retreats from effort and gravitates toward whatever feels simplest. This is the psychological landscape in which convenience thrives. An easy choice feels like relief. A preselected option feels like kindness. An algorithmic suggestion feels like help. Anything that removes the burden of choosing feels like comfort. And comfort, once it becomes familiar, becomes irresistible. This is why people reach for the same apps every morning, follow the same recommendations, accept the same ideas, and drift into the same patterns of thought. It's not because they lack intelligence or willpower. It's because the mind, when fatigued, prefers paths that require no effort, cognitive or emotional. This quiet exhaustion shapes more of our thinking than we admit. It influences what we believe, how we argue, what we avoid, and what we accept. It makes shallow answers feel appealing and complex questions feel unnecessarily heavy. Even our values begin to shift. We start to reward anything that saves us mental work, and we mistrust anything that demands it. The tragedy is that the more we rely on easy choices, the more difficult real choices become. The mind loses its tolerance for uncertainty, ambiguity, and complexity. All essential components of critical thinking. It starts to crave the familiar, because the familiar doesn't drain its limited energy. Over time, the preference for simplicity evolves into a dependency. This dependency creates a world where people avoid decisions that require thought, turn away from issues that require patience, and resist discussions that require nuance. They prefer to adopt the opinions of their community. They prefer to let algorithms filter reality for them. They prefer answers that arrive already packaged, already simplified, already framed. They prefer the comfort of certainty over the discomfort of inquiry. But something subtle is lost in this trade. When people no longer choose with intention, they lose a sense of agency. When choices feel automatic, life feels automatic. When the burden of thinking disappears, the meaning behind thinking disappears with it. And in that space, the space where the mind feels too tired to resist comfort becomes not just appealing, but persuasive. It becomes a philosophy in disguise, a worldview where difficulty is seen as a flaw, effort as an inconvenience, and simplicity as a virtue. Yet beneath this shift lies a deeper consequence. When we grow dependent on easy choices, we stop seeking new experiences. We stop exploring unfamiliar ideas. We stop challenging our assumptions. Curiosity fades, replaced by the instinct to preserve energy. But the disappearance of curiosity doesn't happen all at once. It begins subtly, in moments when the easy choice feels safer than the interesting one. And this leads us naturally into the next stage of the comfort trap. A stage where convenience doesn't just influence what we choose, but what we desire to know. A stage where the hunger for exploration slowly dissolves. A stage where the mind, once open and inquisitive, becomes satisfied with just enough information to stay comfortable. And that brings us directly into our next chapter. Curiosity is one of the oldest instincts of the human mind. It is the spark that pushed early humans to cross oceans, climb mountains, map stars, and question everything that seemed fixed or unquestionable. Curiosity is the engine of exploration, invention, philosophy, science, the quiet force that expands the world from the inside out. Yet in the modern era, curiosity is weakening. Not because people lack intelligence, but because the environment no longer encourages questions. Convenience gives the illusion that there is nothing left to wonder about. When answers arrive instantly, the desire to seek slowly begins to dissolve. The mind loses the sensation of not knowing, the gentle itch that once pushed it toward discovery. The moment a question appears, a device resolves it. The moment confusion arises, a search bar eliminates it. The moment a gap of knowledge opens, an explanation fills it immediately. Curiosity needs space to grow. Modern life fills every space. The mind becomes accustomed to a world where uncertainty lasts only seconds. In such a world, the long, patient process of exploration begins to feel unnecessary, even inefficient. People stop following questions on their own and begin waiting for answers to be delivered, not because they don't care, but because they no longer remember what it feels like to chase an idea. The deepest form of curiosity is not about information. It is about attention. It requires lingering on a thought, circling it, returning to it, allowing it to unfold one layer at a time. But attention has become fragmented. Convenience encourages rapid shifts, quick impressions, immediate conclusions. It rewards speed, not depth. When attention fragments, curiosity evaporates. A mind trained for constant stimulation cannot tolerate the slow rhythm of exploration. It becomes restless in the presence of complexity, impatient in the presence of silence, uncomfortable in the presence of mystery. It seeks resolution, not revelation, and resolution is always easier to find than revelation. Convenience also teaches the mind that effort is optional, but curiosity is effort. Gentle effort, but effort nonetheless. It is the willingness to look twice at something instead of once, to read past the first paragraph instead of stopping, to ask a second question instead of accepting the first answer. When effort feels unnatural, curiosity becomes rare. There is also a subtle, emotional shift. Curiosity thrives on openness, humility, the ability to admit, I don't know, but I want to know. Yet convenience encourages a feeling of pseudo-competence, the sense that one already has enough knowledge, enough answers, enough surface-level understanding. This illusion of knowing suppresses the desire to know more. People feel informed after reading a headline, watching a short clip, hearing a simplified explanation. The mind receives the taste of knowledge without doing any of the work that produces real understanding. It becomes full too quickly, satisfied too easily. Curiosity needs hunger. Modern convenience creates constant fullness. Something else begins to change as well. The way people relate to boredom. Boredom was once a gateway to creativity, imagination, and spontaneous inquiry. In quiet moments, the mind wandered, and wandering often led to unexpected ideas. But today, boredom is eliminated instantly. A swipe, a notification, a video, a feed. Stimulation arrives. The moment silence appears. The mind never wanders, because the moment it tries, something interrupts. And without wandering, curiosity is nowhere to travel. At its core, curiosity is a form of inner movement, a drift towards something unknown. But a life filled with constant convenience leaves little unknown. Not because the world is fully explained, but because the mind is no longer looking. It stops asking deeper questions. It stops searching for patterns. It stops noticing what lies beneath the surface. And when the act of noticing disappears, so does the desire to understand. A comfortable world may feel pleasant, but it can quietly shrink the imagination. It can shrink the appetite for discovery. It can shrink the very part of the mind that longs to go beyond the obvious. Curiosity fades not with a loud collapse, but with a quiet settling, a settling into routines, into automated choices, into the reassuring simplicity of convenience. And as curiosity fades, something else quietly changes in the way the mind engages with difficulty, effort, and sustained thinking. A change that shapes not only what we explore, but how long we are able to stay with a thought before turning away. Comfort does not only shape how we think, it shapes how we feel. For many people, convenience has become more than a tool. It has become a refuge, a place to retreat from discomfort, tension, uncertainty, and emotional friction. A psychological shelter built out of ease. Modern life offers 1,000 small exits from difficult emotions. The moment stress rises, entertainment is one tap away. The moment loneliness appears, a stream of messages and voices fills the silence. The moment insecurity surfaces, curated images offer distraction. The moment boredom arrives, stimulation floods in to drown it. Convenience softens every edge of experience, absorbing discomfort before it has a chance to teach us anything. But emotional discomfort is not a flaw in human experience. It is one of its most important teachers. Stress tells us what matters. Confusion signals where learning begins. Loneliness points toward connection and meaning. Boredom opens space for creativity and imagination. Uncertainty encourages reflection and questioning. When every uncomfortable emotion is immediately anesthetized, the inner world begins to flatten. The range of emotion narrows. The ability to tolerate difficulty weakens. A subtle fragility forms, not because the world has become harsher, but because the mind has lost practice engaging with its own depth. Convenience turns emotional discomfort into something abnormal, something to be avoided, something that must be immediately resolved. But emotions are not problems to be fixed. They are signals to be understood. When those signals are avoided again and again, people lose familiarity with their own interior landscapes. They become uncomfortable with silence because silence reveals what is unresolved. They become uncomfortable with stillness because stillness exposes the thoughts they've been avoiding. They become uncomfortable with introspection because introspection requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to sit with truths that cannot be solved instantly. Convenience gives the illusion that emotional work is unnecessary, but emotional work is the foundation of maturity. A mind protected from discomfort becomes a mind unprepared for reality. Even small challenges begin to feel overwhelming. Constructive criticism feels like attack. Ambiguity feels threatening. Failure feels catastrophic. Unexpected stress feels intolerable. When ease becomes the baseline, difficulty feels like a crisis. This emotional fragility doesn't appear all at once. It emerges slowly through habits of avoidance. Every escape from discomfort reinforces the belief that discomfort is dangerous. And the more we flee from discomfort, the less capable we become of facing it. Yet life does not stop presenting challenges simply because we prefer comfort. Relationships require patience, compromise. Work requires resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to stretch beyond our limits. Growth requires confrontation with our own shortcomings. Identity requires reflection. Meaning requires struggle. These experiences cannot be accessed through shortcuts. But convenience trained us to think that everything important should also feel easy. That if something is emotionally demanding, it's the wrong path. That negative emotions are evidence of failure rather than opportunities to learn. This mindset quietly erodes critical thinking because critical thinking requires emotional bravery. To challenge a belief demands discomfort. To examine ourselves demands honesty. To confront uncertainty demands stability. To consider new perspectives demands a willingness to let go of familiar ones. When emotional discomfort is avoided, intellectual discomfort is avoided with it. People repeat ideas that feel emotionally safe, not ideas that feel true. They avoid complex issues that stir anxiety. They dismiss questions that unsettle their self-image. They cling to narratives that soothe rather than challenge. Emotion precedes thought. If emotions are shaped by comfort, thoughts will be shaped by comfort as well. There is another layer to this. The emotional dependency that develops when comfort becomes the primary coping mechanism. The mind begins to seek relief rather than understanding, stimulation rather than insight, escape rather than engagement. Even moments that could awaken curiosity or reflection become opportunities for distraction instead. And as the inner world becomes quieter, not in the peaceful sense, but in the numb sense, people lose the ability to feel deeply. Not just negative emotions, but positive ones as well. Joy loses its intensity. Meaning loses its richness. Connection loses its depth. A life built on comfort often feels smooth, but rarely feels profound. Emotional escape gradually evolves into emotional absence, a subtle disconnection from oneself. And once a person becomes disconnected from their emotional world, they become disconnected from the natural energies that feed focus, exploration, resilience, and critical thinking. The mind becomes quieter, but not in the way it longs for. It becomes quiet because it has stopped listening. There was a time when the mind could stay with a single idea for long stretches of time, when people read entire books without checking anything else, when they followed a complex argument from beginning to end without drifting away, when thinking was not something squeezed between distractions, but something given the full space of one's attention. Today, that endurance is dissolving. Not because our minds have changed biologically, but because the environment around us no longer encourages long engagement. The rhythm of modern life fragments attention. Notifications interrupt thoughts before they form. Endless feeds scatter the mind across dozens of unrelated topics in minutes. Entertainment moves so quickly that stillness feels unnatural. The ability to stay with a thought, to hold it, examine it, turn it around, follow where it leads, begins to weaken. Cognitive endurance fades quietly. It is not something we notice immediately. It disappears in subtle shifts. A book feels heavier than it used to. A long conversation feels demanding. A complex idea feels overwhelming. Silence feels uncomfortable. The mind, once capable of depth, now reaches for escape at the first sign of friction. Cognitive endurance is not about intelligence. It is about stamina, the stamina to think without constant reward, stimulation, or novelty. But modern tools train the mind to expect stimulation at all times. Every moment offers something new, something bright, something easy. Nothing requires patience. And because nothing requires patience, patience itself becomes scarce. The mind becomes accustomed to mental fast food. It begins to crave the quick hit, the instant payoff, the immediate sense of closure. Anything that unfolds slowly feels distant. Anything complex feels like a burden. Anything requiring sustained attention feels incompatible with the pace of life. Yet the most important forms of thinking require endurance. Deep reading, deep listening, deep analysis, or rely on the ability to remain with an idea longer than is comfortable. Insights appear not in the first few seconds of thought, but after time has passed, after confusion has softened, after clarity has had a chance to form. Without endurance, the mind never reaches this deeper layer. Instead, it skims across the surface of everything. It becomes good at recognizing patterns, but bad at understanding them. Good at repeating ideas, but bad at evaluating them. Good at reacting, but bad at reasoning. Endurance turns knowledge into insight. Without it, knowledge remains thin, something stored, not something understood. There is also an emotional component. Cognitive endurance requires the ability to tolerate frustration, to stay with a question even when the answer is not immediately clear, to move through the discomfort of not knowing, to keep going despite mental resistance. But a life shaped by convenience trains the mind to avoid these moments. The moment frustration arises, escape is available. With one click, the discomfort disappears. And because the discomfort disappears so easily, the mind never learns to work through it. This has consequences that reach far beyond thinking. When someone lacks cognitive endurance, they become dependent on external structure. They rely on simplified explanations. They become vulnerable to manipulative narratives that offer clarity without effort. They struggle to distinguish truth from noise because truth often requires time. Endurance is what allows the mind to separate appearance from essence. Without it, everything looks the same. There is another dimension to the decline of endurance. The loss of immersion. Immersion is the state where the mind becomes fully absorbed in something, a book, a project, a conversation, a thought. In immersion, time softens. Distraction falls away. The inner world deepens. Immersion is one of the most nourishing experiences a human mind can have. It restores clarity, strengthens memory, sharpens intuition, and renews creativity. But immersion cannot coexist with constant interruption. The modern world interrupts so frequently that the mind rarely drops into deeper states of thought. When immersion disappears, the mind becomes restless. It seeks stimulation instead of engagement. It seeks novelty instead of meaning. It explores wide, but not deep. A life without cognitive endurance becomes a life without inner depth. Yet endurance is not lost forever. It can be rebuilt gently, gradually, through the simple act of staying. Staying with a page a little longer. Staying with a problem a little longer. Staying with a question a little longer. Staying present long after the instinct to escape appears. In the quiet act of staying, the mind remembers what it once knew, that effort is not the enemy of clarity, but the path to it. In the age of convenience, information has become abundant, but understanding has not. The modern world offers an endless stream of facts, fragments, summaries, clips, headlines, opinions, and quick takes. Knowledge feels omnipresent, woven into every corner of daily life. Yet beneath the surface of this abundance lies a striking paradox. The more information we have, the shallower our engagement with it becomes. Shallow information is easy to consume. It demands nothing from us. It doesn't ask for patience, attention, or reflection. It comes pre-digested, lightweight, simplified. It provides the illusion of knowledge without requiring the process of learning. Convenience culture thrives on this type of information because it fits perfectly with the rhythms of modern attention. Short, fast, emotionally charged content spreads more quickly than anything that requires depth or contemplation. Platforms are designed to favor the easy over the meaningful. A 10-second clip travels faster than a careful argument. A catchy headline travels farther than a research paper. A simplified opinion becomes more popular than a nuanced explanation. A viral phrase becomes more influential than a complex idea. And gradually, without consciously choosing it, we begin to prefer the shallow forms. Not because we want less understanding, but because understanding asks us to slow down, and slowing down feels incompatible with the speed of everything else. Shallow information is comforting in its simplicity. It gives us just enough to feel informed, but not enough to challenge us. It offers certainty where reality offers ambiguity. It offers clarity where truth offers complexity. It offers belonging where independent thinking offers solitude. But this comfort comes at a cost. When the mind repeatedly consumes information that is light, fast, and emotionally charged, it adapts to that pattern. It becomes impatient with anything deeper. Longer texts feel heavy. Complex topics feel overwhelming. Thoughtful explanations feel unnecessary. Ambivalent truths feel frustrating. The mind begins to reject anything that cannot be absorbed instantly. This creates a cycle. The more shallow information we consume, the more we crave it. And the more we crave it, the less we are capable of engaging with anything else. Even our sense of knowledge becomes distorted. We feel informed because we have access to so much. Even if we understand so little, we can repeat facts without context, opinions without reasoning, and narratives without awareness of what they omit. The appearance of intelligence becomes easier to perform than the practice of intelligence. There is also a social element. Shallow information spreads because it reinforces group identity. Short slogans, simplified narratives, emotional catchphrases. These become symbols of belonging. People share them not because they represent truth, but because they represent alignment. Depth rarely goes viral, but simplicity does. And when simplicity rewards us with validation, approval, and a sense of community, the temptation to stay on the surface grows stronger. Shallow information also creates a cognitive illusion. The illusion that we understand far more than we actually do. This illusion is dangerous because it removes the very discomfort that leads to inquiry. If we believe we already know, why would we question? If we believe we understand, why would we learn? If we believe we are informed, why would we explore further? The disappearance of discomfort becomes the disappearance of curiosity, and the disappearance of curiosity becomes the disappearance of critical thinking. Shallow information is not harmful because it is incomplete. All information is incomplete. It is harmful because it is consumed without awareness of what is missing. The gaps vanish from perception. The questions never arise. The contradictions remain invisible. And when contradictions are invisible, thinking cannot begin. The greatest danger of a convenience-driven information world is not misinformation. It is oversimplification creates a reality that is easy to digest, but impossible to understand. It reduces the world to binaries. Two slogans, two narratives so thin they cannot hold the weight of truth. The mind shrinks to fit the simplicity it consumes. Yet beneath all this, the deeper tragedy is not that information has become shallow, but that we have been trained to feel satisfied by it. The hunger for depth fades when the appetite is constantly dulled by convenience. But depth is still possible. It still lives in the quiet spaces where attention stretches, where curiosity awakens, where the mind remembers how to linger. Shallow information may dominate the surface of modern life, but the deeper layers of understanding are still waiting, always available to anyone willing to reach for them. Discipline once shaped the rhythm of everyday life. People rose with the sun, worked for hours at a time, practiced skills repeatedly, studied without distraction, and moved through routines shaped by necessity rather than preference. Effort was not optional. It was built into the structure of existence. Today, that structure has dissolved. Convenience has softened nearly every corner of daily life, and with it, the quiet strength that discipline once required has begun to fade. Discipline grows in environments where effort is unavoidable, when something must be done because survival depends on it, reputation depends on it, family depends on it. The mind naturally organizes itself around long-term goals. Delaying gratification feels normal. Working through discomfort feels meaningful. Staying committed feels like part of being alive. But in a world where most tasks can be automated, delegated, postponed, or avoided altogether, discipline no longer grows automatically. It must be cultivated intentionally, and that is difficult in an environment designed to eliminate friction. Convenience offers the promise of a life without effort. Devices remember tasks for us. Apps structure our routines. Notifications guide our attention, and tools simplify what was once complex. The mind no longer needs to hold commitments. External systems do it for us. But when commitments no longer live inside us, they no longer shape us. Discipline is not about completing a task. It is about being transformed by the act of staying with something. It is the gradual strengthening of will, patience, and resilience. It is the steady alignment of actions with intention. When everything becomes easy, intention becomes weak. The erosion of discipline appears subtly at first. Tasks that require effort feel heavier than they used to. Projects lose momentum halfway through. Concentration fractures more easily. Motivation fades when rewards are not immediate. The mind becomes accustomed to the feeling of giving up early. Not because it lacks ambition, but because it lacks the internal muscle needed to persist. Discipline is a muscle, and like any muscle, it weakens when it is not used. Another difficulty arises from the emotional environment shaped by convenience. People increasingly expect to feel motivated before they begin something. They wait for inspiration, for clarity, for the perfect moment. But discipline is built not on inspiration, but on consistency, on showing up, even when the feeling is absent. Convenience teaches the opposite lesson. If it doesn't feel good immediately, stop. If it feels uncomfortable, escape. If it feels difficult, switch to something easy. The relationship between mind and discomfort begins to shift. Instead of discomfort being a signal to grow, it becomes a signal to flee. This shift weakens not only discipline, but character. Every meaningful accomplishment, intellectual, creative, emotional, physical, requires the ability to move through discomfort with purpose. When that ability fades, potential fades with it. Another dimension of the erosion of discipline lies in the constant availability of distraction. The mind has always been tempted to wander, but never before has it had such a rich world to disappear into. Every moment of effort competes with a universe of escape waiting on the same device. The mind does not even need to leave the desk or the bed to abandon its goals. The temptation is immediate and endless, and when escape becomes effortless, commitment becomes fragile. This fragility reveals itself in daily life. Unfinished books, interrupted conversations, abandoned goals, scattered habits, half-formed plans. Not because people lack passion, but because they lack the endurance to stay with their intentions long enough for them to take root. Discipline is the bridge between desire and achievement. Without it, desire remains only a possibility, a dream untested by effort. The erosion of discipline also affects our relationship with time. Convenience compresses time. Everything feels faster, shorter, more immediate. But discipline requires a slower relationship with time, one measured in months, years, and lifelong commitments. The mind must be able to hold a long-term vision, even when the present feels unreal. Yet the pace of modern life trains us to think in short bursts, short videos, short messages, short tasks, short attention. Long-term thinking becomes unfamiliar, and long-term effort becomes unsustainable. The deeper tragedy is that without discipline, the self begins to feel unhappy. Commitments give life shape. Routines give the mind stability. Effort creates meaning. The pursuit of difficult things creates identity. When discipline fades, these anchors loosen. People feel directionless, not because they lack ability, but because nothing inside them is being consistently strengthened. But discipline is not lost forever. It can be rebuilt slowly, gently, through presence, patience, and the simple act of doing what doesn't feel easy. There is a growing sense, subtle yet unmistakable, that the modern mind is no longer the primary author of its own thoughts. Not fully, not consistently, not with the same autonomy that once defined human thinking. Algorithms now occupy the spaces where imagination once wandered. They guide what we see, what we hear, what we consider, what we believe, and even what we desire. They filter the world before it reaches us, shaping the boundaries of our attention long before we consciously choose anything at all. This influence appears harmless on the surface. Recommendations feel helpful. Search results feel neutral. Curated feeds feel convenient. Suggestions feel personalized. as if designed to serve our deepest interests. But convenience has a way of concealing control. Every recommendation is a decision made on our behalf. Every filtered feed is a world arranged according to someone else's priorities. Every "you might like" this is a subtle redirection of attention, away from what we might have chosen for ourselves and toward what the system predicts we will engage with most easily. Over time, these predictions begin to shape preference itself. The mind starts to follow the paths laid out for it, paths designed to maximize engagement rather than truth, clarity, or growth. It becomes easier to accept what is shown than to explore what is hidden. The curiosity that would have led us to unexpected ideas grows quiet, replaced by the comfort of being guided. The tragedy is not that algorithms are malicious, but that they are efficient. They are designed to reduce friction, and thinking is full of friction. So much so that the mind, tired from thousands of micro-decisions and endless distraction, welcomes the assistance. It feels good to let the world be chosen for us. It feels good to not have to search deeply. It feels good to have entertainment, information, and opinions delivered without effort. But the more we outsource these choices, the more the internal muscles of thought weaken. The ability to navigate complexity, to sift truth from noise, to challenge assumptions, to explore beyond the obvious, all begin to fade. Thought becomes reactive rather than intentional. Even the questions we ask change. Instead of "what do I think?" we begin to ask, "what is everyone saying?" Instead of "where can I find knowledge?" we ask, "what's trending?" Instead of "what do I want to explore?" we drift into whatever appears first, easiest, or most familiar. The mind stops initiating and begins responding. This shift is subtle because it rarely feels like loss. Instead, it feels like relief. Relief from the burden of decision. Relief from the discomfort of complexity. Relief from the responsibility of filtering the world ourselves. But relief is not the same as freedom. Freedom requires the ability to see beyond what is presented, to question the frame itself, to choose consciously rather than automatically, to walk paths that algorithms do not suggest. When a person relies too heavily on curated feeds and predictive systems, the inner compass begins to dim, not because the person is incapable of thinking, but because their environment no longer requires it. In earlier eras, thinking was shaped by curiosity, necessity, and direct experience. People learned by observing nature, by listening, by reading deeply, by questioning elders, by reflecting on lived moments. Knowledge grew slowly but organically, rooted in personal exploration. Today, thinking often grows from whatever appears at the top of a screen. The hierarchy of visibility becomes the hierarchy of belief. This is not accidental. Digital platforms prioritize what keeps us watching, not what helps us think. They elevate what stimulates emotion, not what encourages reflection. They amplify what is easy to digest, not what is difficult to understand. When the architecture of information is built on convenience, thought becomes shaped by convenience as well. The mind forgets how to wander beyond what is offered. It forgets how to research, analyze, cross-examine. It forgets how to struggle productively with uncertainty. It forgets how to seek truth rather than stimulation. Gradually, without resistance, thinking becomes synonymous with consuming, not creating, not questioning, not discovering. And when thinking collapses into consumption, the individual mind loses its shape. Yet within this quiet erosion lies a deeper psychological shift. When we allow external systems to think for us, we stop noticing the limits they impose. The frame becomes invisible. The boundaries feel natural. The curated becomes indistinguishable from the real. Awareness fades, and with it, the possibility of stepping outside the comfort that is quietly shaping our inner world. Comfort is no longer just a personal preference. It has become a cultural expectation. Entire societies are now organized around the idea that life should feel smooth, easy, and free of unnecessary effort. Hardship is framed as a failure of planning. Struggle is seen as a sign that something has gone wrong. Effort is perceived not as a natural part of growth, but as a flaw in the system. The result is a world where comfort is treated not only as desirable, but as normal, even deserved. This shift changes how people interpret their own experiences. When life feels challenging, they assume it shouldn't be. When an idea is difficult to understand, They conclude it is not worth the time. When a task requires patience, they feel something unnatural is being asked of them. When someone disagrees with them, they interpret it as hostility. They become accustomed to pathways without obstacles and conversations without friction. The expectation of comfort becomes a lens through which reality is viewed. This lens shapes not only individuals, but communities. Social norms shift toward the avoidance of discomfort. People praise convenience as progress. They frame effort as outdated. They celebrate shortcuts as innovation. They equate ease with intelligence. A generation raised in this environment does not simply enjoy comfort, it grows dependent on it. Comfort becomes an emotional baseline. It becomes the standard against which every experience is measured. Anything that disrupts this baseline ambiguity, disagreement, slowness, difficulty, feels wrong on a visceral level. The result is a society that becomes increasingly intolerant of discomfort in all forms. People become hesitant to face conflict. They avoid conversations that challenge their assumptions. They withdraw from experiences that stretch them emotionally. They resist any environment that doesn't cater to their preferences. They demand safe spaces, not to protect themselves from harm, but to shield themselves from challenge. The cultural elevation of comfort reshapes collective behavior in subtle ways. Social harmony becomes more important than truth. Agreement becomes more valuable than inquiry. Polished appearances matter more than authentic complexity. People police each other's tone, but not each other's reasoning. When discomfort is treated as an enemy, questioning becomes impolite, and critical thought becomes socially risky. This environment discourages the traits that sustain independent thinking: patience, resilience, intellectual humility, openness to being wrong. Instead, it encourages fragility. A fragility disguised as sensitivity, but rooted in avoidance. As comfort becomes the norm, society begins to protect individuals from experiences that once helped them mature. Children are shielded from struggle, so they grow up with less tolerance for frustration. Students are insulated from challenging ideas, so they mature with less resilience toward complexity. Adults are surrounded by instant solutions, so they lose the ability to navigate ambiguity. People may appear confident on the surface, but underneath the confidence lies an emotional thinness, a vulnerability to anything that requires inner strength. This cultural shift also changes what people expect from institutions, relationships, and even themselves. They look for work that feels easy from the beginning. They look for friendships that never involve conflict. They look for partners who never challenge them. They look for meaning that arrives instantly, without the long work of building it. And when these impossible expectations fail, they interpret the failure as evidence that something external is wrong, rather than recognizing the internal erosion of endurance. One of the more subtle consequences of comfort becoming a norm is that it shapes moral judgment. People begin to classify experiences not by whether they are right or wrong, but by whether they feel comfortable or uncomfortable. Ideas that challenge them become harmful. Differences become dangerous, unpleasant. Truths become aggressive. The line between discomfort and harm blurs, but discomfort is not harm. Discomfort is a catalyst, a necessary friction through which strength, clarity, and depth of understanding emerge. When a culture rejects discomfort, it rejects the conditions required for wisdom. The expectation of comfort also alters the social fabric. Communities that once grew through shared struggle now dissolve into groups defined by identical preferences. People gather not around purpose, but around convenience. They disconnect the moment inconvenience appears. This creates a paradox. The more people demand comfort, the more disconnected and unfulfilled they become. Comfort may soothe the surface of life, but it cannot nourish the soul of it. Meaning does not come from ease. It comes from engagement. Fulfillment does not come from avoidance. It comes from participation. Growth does not come from protection. It comes from challenge. Ebet, mind the most adaptable part of the human being, begins to crave what comfort cannot provide: depth, richness, understanding, purpose, truth. A fragile mind is not one that lacks intelligence. It is not one that lacks potential, talent, or ability. A fragile mind is simply a mind that has not been asked to stretch. A mind that has not been challenged, tempered, or tested. A mind that has lived too long in environments designed to protect rather than strengthen it. Comfort, when absorbed too deeply, begins to thin out the internal structure of thought. It removes the small daily frictions that once built resilience. The moments of waiting, the moments of uncertainty, the moments of boredom, the moments of slow progress, the moments of effort that didn't immediately reward us. These were not obstacles to thinking. They were the soil in which thinking grew. Witoth, Tim, the inner architecture becomes delicate. In a comfortable world, frustration becomes intolerable. A minor setback feels like a major crisis. A conflicting opinion feels like a personal attack. A difficult idea feels like an unjust burden. A slow process feels like something is wrong. The mind loses its tolerance for discomfort. And without that tolerance, it loses its capacity for depth. A fragile mind withdraws from anything that stretches it. It prefers worlds that match its expectations, ideas that confirm its assumptions, and people who reflect its beliefs. But thinking cannot expand in such an environment. It becomes self-referential, circular, enclosed. People who have grown accustomed to comfort often confuse emotional intensity with emotional strength. They may react passionately, but they struggle to hold complexity. They may feel deeply, but they are easily They may speak confidently, but their confidence collapses when confronted with resistance. Strength is not measured by reaction, it is measured by endurance. Comfort masks fragility until the first real test arrives. A failure, a contradiction, a challenge, a disagreement, a truth that doesn't align with expectation. In these moments, the limits of a comfort-shaped mind become visible. The mind that has not practiced staying with difficulty will flee from it. It will rationalize, deflect, attack, or avoid. It will cling to simplicity because complexity feels threatening. It will cling to certainty because uncertainty feels unbearable. It'll cling to groups that echo its thinking because independent judgment feels too heavy. Comfort creates fragility not by weakening the mind directly, but by depriving it of the experiences that make it strong. Resilience is formed in the presence of discomfort. Patience is formed in the presence of delay. Clarity is formed in the presence of confusion. Wisdom is formed in the presence of contradiction. Courage is formed in the presence of fear. When convenience shields us from these experiences, resilience, patience, clarity, wisdom, and courage do not disappear. They simply never develop. There is also a subtler form of fragility, intellectual fragility. It appears when a person cannot tolerate the idea of being wrong, not because they are arrogant, but because the emotional cost of error feels too overwhelming. Comfort teaches the mind that everything should feel smooth. Being wrong feels jagged, sharp, disruptive. A fragile thinker views disagreement as conflict rather than as conversation. They interpret questions as criticism and alternative perspectives as threats. The mind becomes defensive instead of curious. This defensiveness collapses the possibility of growth. New ideas cannot enter if the door is locked from the inside. Another form of fragility arises from the fragmentation of attention. A mind shaped by constant stimulation finds it difficult to hold anything heavy. Thoughts slide across the surface rather than entering deeply. The mind becomes restless in its own company, uncomfortable with stillness, uneasy with introspection. Without the ability to sit with a thought, a person cannot build the inner stability needed to withstand discomfort. The mind becomes fragile not because it is weak, but because it is scattered. There is also emotional fragility, nurtured not by pain, but by the absence of it. When someone lives insulated from adversity, their emotional threshold lowers. They become overwhelmed by experiences that once would have been manageable. Their reactions become disproportionate to their challenges, not because the challenges are larger, but because their inner resources are smaller. Yet the deepest fragility formed by comfort is existential. A life shaped entirely by ease eventually feels shallow. When nothing requires effort, nothing feels earned. When nothing is earned, nothing feels meaningful. People begin to wonder why their lives lack direction, fulfillment, purpose. Even when surrounded by everything designed to make life easy, meaning does not grow in comfort. Meaning grows in engagement, challenge, participation, and the willingness to face discomfort with intention. A comfortable life can soothe the surface of a person's existence, but it cannot strengthen the foundation of it. Strength requires friction. Depth requires pressure. Growth requires discomfort. Without them, the mind remains delicate, no matter how bright, no matter how capable, no matter how confident it appears from the outside. Escaping the comfort trap does not begin with dramatic changes or grand declarations. It begins with noticing. Noticing how deeply convenience has woven itself into the structure of thought. How quietly ease has reshaped expectations. How subtly the mind has adapted to a world designed to remove friction. Awakening begins the moment we realize that the forces shaping our thinking are not neutral. Convenience promises freedom, but often delivers dependence. It makes the world feel smoother, yet it can leave the mind feeling dull. It removes obstacles, yet it quietly removes the very qualities that obstacles once cultivated. And when someone finally sees this pattern in themselves, a shift begins to form, not out of guilt or pressure, but out of longing. There's always a moment, sometimes brief and quiet, when a person realizes they miss their own mind. Not the distracted, impatient, overstimulated mind shaped by modern life, but the younger version that could wander for hours, that could read without restlessness, that could sit in silence without feeling the need to escape it. Something inside recognizes that ease has taken up too much space. The path out of the comfort trap begins with small acts of re-engagement. Moments where the mind is allowed to feel friction again. Moments where silence is invited rather than filled. Moments where questions are allowed to linger without rushing toward answers. Moments where effort is embraced, not as suffering, but as nourishment. Escaping comfort does not mean rejecting convenience. It means restoring balance, restoring the part of ourselves that grows only through challenge. The first sign of this restoration is often a renewed relationship with slowness. Slowness used to be the natural rhythm of human life. Thoughts had time to stretch. Feelings had time to unfold. Experiences had time to settle into memory. In slowness, the mind discovers its depth again. When someone begins to slow down, the texture of their awareness changes. They notice details they once overlooked. They feel emotions they once suppressed. They think thoughts they once avoided. They begin to experience the world directly rather than through the scaffolding of constant mediation. Slowness creates space for clarity, not dramatic clarity, but the quiet kind that arrives without effort, like a horizon gradually revealing itself as fog lifts. Another part of escaping the comfort trap is rediscovering difficulty, not as an enemy, but as a companion. Difficulty shapes character in ways comfort never will. It refines attention, strengthens endurance, deepens understanding. It forces the mind to stretch beyond its habits. There is a kind of beauty in choosing something difficult intentionally. Reading something that challenges the intellect. Learning something that resists quick mastery. Staying with a problem instead of abandoning it. Feeling the initial discomfort and moving past it until effort becomes engagement. In these moments, the mind remembers its strength. It remembers that it is capable of more than convenience has allowed it to express. There is also an important shift that occurs when someone begins to reclaim their inner world. The shift from passive consumption to active creation. Creation can take many forms. Writing, building, studying, questioning, making something new, or simply thinking deeply about something old. Creation requires effort, but effort in service of something meaningful never feels wasted. Convenience teaches us to take in the world. Creation teaches us to give something back to it. The more a person creates, the more alive the mind feels. Thoughts regain texture. Curiosity regains gravity. Ideas regain substance. The cell begins to feel less like a reactor and more like a source. Escaping the comfort trap also involves learning to sit again with discomfort. Emotional, intellectual, existential. Not to suffer, but to strengthen. Not to break, but to grow. Discomfort is information. It points toward the places where development is possible. It reveals limitations, fears, and assumptions that convenience has kept hidden. When someone stops escaping discomfort, they start listening to it. And what they hear is often the beginning of transformation. There is a quiet irony in this entire journey. The things that make life meaningful are rarely the things that come easily. Meaning grows where effort meets intention. Purpose grows where struggle meets curiosity. Wisdom grows where discomfort meets reflection. Escaping the comfort trap is not about rejecting ease. It is about reclaiming the parts of ourselves that ease cannot reach. It is about recovering the strength, resilience, imagination, and clarity that only awaken when we engage deeply with life. And as the mind begins to remember what it can be, comfort stops being a trap and becomes something simpler. A place to rest, not a place to live. There comes a moment in every life when a person realizes that something essential has drifted to the edges of their awareness. Not something external, but something internal. A quality, a clarity, a stillness, a strength they once possessed without effort. It is the sense that the mind used to feel wider, more capable of holding thoughts that stretched toward the horizon. It is the memory of depth. Depth is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is not loud or urgent. Depth is the quiet density of a mind that has spent time with itself. It is the steadiness that forms when thoughts are allowed to unfold slowly rather than being interrupted. It is the unity between curiosity and discipline, between emotion and understanding, between intelligence and patience. A life built entirely on comfort rarely touches this depth. Comfort smooths the surface of experience, but depth lives beneath the surface. It waits in the spaces that convenience teaches us to avoid, the spaces of silence, uncertainty, effort, and reflection. These spaces can feel unfamiliar at first, even intimidating, because they require the mind to meet itself without distraction. But when someone finally enters them again, something remarkable begins to happen. Thoughts gain weight, emotions gain coherence, the world regains texture, the self regains shape. Depth is not a destination. It is a way of being present. To return to depth is to rediscover the richness of slow thinking. It is to feel the mind awaken from the inside, not with stimulation, but with understanding. It is to experience moments where clarity does not arrive instantly, but gradually, like a landscape emerging from morning mist. This clarity is different from the quick confidence offered by shallow information. It is gentler, more grounded, more honest. It carries with it the humility of someone who knows they are still learning, and that humility becomes the foundation of wisdom. Depth also brings a different relationship with discomfort. Instead of fleeing from it, we begin to understand it. Discomfort is no longer a threat. It is a signpost. It points toward the areas where growth is possible. It reveals where we are resisting something necessary. It shows us what we have avoided, not because it was dangerous, but because it was unfamiliar. When we stop fearing discomfort, we stop fearing ourselves. The return to depth changes our relationship with time as well. Life stops feeling like a sequence of interruptions. Moments gain shape. Experiences gain meaning. Attention becomes an act of devotion rather than a resource constantly drained. Time itself begins to feel fuller, not because hours have changed, but because we have. Depth is not something we acquire. It is something we remember. Even the smallest acts can bring us back to this remembrance. Reading a page without checking anything else, listening to someone without planning a response, sitting in silence without reaching for stimulation, thinking a thought all the way through. These acts seem simple, almost trivial, but they restore the mind's natural architecture. They reawaken capacities dulled by convenience, patience, endurance, curiosity, judgment, inner stability. A person who returns to depth does not reject the modern world. They simply stop letting it dictate the pace of their inner life. They choose their attention rather than surrender it. They shape their thoughts rather than consume them. They move through the world with an awareness rooted in presence rather than reaction. And as depth returns, something else quietly emerges. Meaning. Meaning is not found in convenience, because convenience asks nothing of us. Meaning grows where we give something time, attention, effort. It grows in the moments when we stretch, when we choose intention over habit, when we remain with a question long enough for it to shape us. Meaning is the gift that depth offers in return for engagement. A life lived with depth does not feel easier, it feels fuller. Challenges become bearable because the mind is no longer fragile. Uncertainty becomes navigable because the mind has room to hold it. Complexity becomes intriguing rather than overwhelming. And discomfort becomes a doorway rather than a dead end. There is no grand conclusion to this journey. There is no final lesson that completes it. Returning to depth is simply the act of remembering that the mind is larger than the world that distracts it, stronger than the comfort that weakens it, and wiser than the algorithms that attempt to shape it. Depth waits patiently, it always. It returns the moment we choose to meet it.